The ALP National Conference will be held next month in Melbourne. Explain the significance of the conference. Why does it matter?
Well, it matters because Labor doesn't have federal or national conferences that often. It tends to have them really once a term, and this is occurring in the middle of this term. It depends on where the numbers are, of course, in terms of how significant it can be. But there have been, as we know over the years, some very incendiary debates and some particularly difficult moments for Labor when Labor's been in government and when it's been in opposition too, and preparing for government. We've seen very spirited debates on uranium, for example, and on some social policy questions. And there could be some of those coming up at this coming national conference.
And conferences in the past, so the leadership of the party has usually been able to rely on a kind of a big block of often union-backed votes from the right, that it's been able to there's been a sort of a discipline within the national conference that hasn't embarrassed the parliamentary wing. How are the numbers? By and large, how are the numbers stacking up for this conference, and will it follow the pattern of previous conferences? Well,
we've got reports in Fairfax Media today suggesting that the numbers are a bit more fluid than they've been in the past, that the grip of these factions and the sort of generals that control them is loosened, and that it may be much harder for any one single force to sort of control the conference, and that presents potentially some influence or some kind of implications for Bill Shorten and for the leadership generally, because it may be that the rank and file, or the delegates of the conference representing the rank and file, push issues that the leadership is not particularly keen to push because they're politically difficult. And one of those could be asylum seekers. The left's often been very concerned about the opposition's position on asylum seekers. It's standing very close to Tony Abbott. There's talk that some in the ALP want to see the party adopt a policy of turnbacks. The reviled, I should say, policy of Tony Abbott's government. But there are some in Labor that say, look, we just need to stand as close as we can to the government on this to minimise the political damage. We can't go back to the situation where we had, thousands of people coming by boat, or have the fear of that happening. That would be electorally disastrous, as well as a policy disaster and a humanitarian disaster. So there could be a very spirited debate on that. The other one that's really, I think, very potentially difficult for Bill Shorten is a suggestion being pushed by the left, and it was even being pushed by his own deputy, Tanya Plibersek, who's of course from the left, to have Labor having a binding vote of its MPs on same-sex marriage reform. So that is, adopt a policy that is for marriage equality and bind all of Labor's MPs to support that as a policy position. Now, of course, it seems like a crazy situation, really, because at the same time, Labor is trying to apply pressure on Tony Abbott to give his MPs a free vote, to have them not bound by party policy, so that enough of them can vote for same-sex equality. So that could be quite difficult for Bill Shorten.
So what we've seen, one way of interpreting what's happened at conferences in the past, you've had some rather passionate debates. The right has often won the argument, not locking in its own position, but arguing that the parliamentary party should have a certain amount of flexibility on policy, so because the most important thing is to win the election, and if they have to make a decision, as you suggested, with, say, people smugglers, to stay close to the government to minimise any sort of losses there. So the outcome here could be that the parliamentary party, whatever the policy is bound much more tightly by conference than it has in the past.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, going back to that comparison between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, one of the things about the Labor Party in the rules is that when there is a binding policy, you have to support it in Parliament, and if you don't, you're basically expelled. So it's fairly serious, potentially. And we know on the gay marriage question, for example, that there are some MPs who take the view that it's an issue that they would never vote for, that they would cross the floor over, that is to vote against any reform. And if the party adopts a position on that and tries to bind its MPs, that would be a potential disaster, I think, for, politically speaking, probably for the issue, actually, but also for the Labor leadership.
Okay, Mark Kenny, it's shaping to be a very interesting conference in Melbourne in July next month. Thanks for your time today.
That's a pleasure, Chris.